Welcome to a podcast by the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. In this episode, our guest is political commentator and contributing National Review editor Deroy Murdock. Deroy was recently in San Francisco to give a talk about the national debt to the San Francisco chapter of the Federalist Society and PRI. The national debt, now about $20 trillion, is perhaps the most serious long-term threat the U.S. economy faces today. Imagine having a credit card where you get to set the limit, and even better, other people pay the bills. Too good to be true? Well, it's what congressional members get to do, and we're the taxpayers who have to pay the bills. Even worse, when Congress starts bumping close to the limit, they don't reduce their expenses. Rather, they just raise the limit, or in the recent case, extend the deadline. This can't go on forever. Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, and I sat down with Deroy Murdock to discuss the problem with the national debt, its impact on the economy, and the long-term consequences. Welcome, Deroy. You and many economists and political commentators talk a lot about the national debt, but it's often hard for the average person to get their arms around this issue. Why should the debt matter to Americans, and what's the real-world impact of high debt on our everyday lives?
Well, Rowena, thanks very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be with you and your listeners. I think the main point on why the national debt is a problem is the fact that when the national debt sits there, it's a big number. It's now at $20 trillion. And like a giant beast, it needs to be fed. And when the government feeds the beast, if you will, it basically has to go out into the private capital markets and borrow money to pay off federal bondholders, people who own U.S. bonds, treasury bonds, that sort of thing. And when Uncle Sam goes into the private capital markets to borrow money to pay the interest on the debt and service the debt, that essentially is Uncle Sam coming into the vault and cleaning it out. And once Uncle Sam is left, there's a lot less money left over for private entrepreneurs who want to borrow money to start businesses or expand businesses, private individuals who want to borrow money in order to buy homes or cars or whatever else it may be, borrow money for college, whatever it is. And that sort of thing makes it harder for people to achieve their own dreams when Uncle Sam is there essentially cleaning the vault out. Some very interesting figures put together by a man named David Malpass, who's a free market economist who was in New York private practice. He's now joined the Trump administration. And he looked at some very interesting figures on the amount of borrowing done in the private sector, basically banks lending. And between the end of 2008, during the big economic meltdown, and the first quarter of 2016, the amount of money that was loaned out to private households only went up 2%. Non-corporate sector businesses went up 15%. Big corporations went up 26%. And the big winner at that time between 2008 and 16 was government. And private banking lending to government increased 80%. So essentially what you had is Uncle Sam and state governments going in and essentially cleaning out 80% of the vault, the other 20% left over to be fought over among corporations, small businesses, and households. And had Uncle Sam not been there cleaning the vault out, there'd be a lot more money left over for people to use to finance their businesses, their new ideas, their American dreams. And in that sense, I think that's probably the most palpable way that the national debt creates a real pain for Americans today.
So it should come as no surprise that the national debt exploded under President Obama. I read that the debt grew from roughly 10.6 trillion when he took office to more than 19.9 trillion when he left the Oval Office. That's something like an 88% increase. What do you think is the legacy of President Obama's spending spree on our economy?
Tim, I think this amazing increase in the national debt, 88%, roughly 10% a year, if you will, over an 8-year presidency, is really going to be the long-term legacy of Obama. It will be his gift that keeps on giving, if you will. It's an amazing, truly staggering testament to his profligacy, and it's something for which people will be paying, even though he's in the private sector now. People will be, in America, will be dealing with the repercussions of this enormous increase in the national debt under one president, 88% increase. It would be one thing, and bad enough, if you saw this huge expansion of the pool of red ink facing this country, if the economy were thriving, if we had 5% growth and 2% unemployment, anybody who wants to get a job gets a job, businesses expanding, healthcare thriving, students learning and doing very well in their grades and so on, then you say, well, all right, it costs a lot of money, we have a lot to show for it. Quite the opposite. We've seen this enormous increase in indebtedness for which we'll be having to pay serious repercussions for many years. And in return for what? An economy that's basically been stuck at about 2% growth. And finally, I think last quarter got up to 3%. Obama is the first president in American history to have not even 1 year of 3% economic growth. 8 years in office, not one of them hit 3% growth. Our highways are a mess. The infrastructure is falling apart in many respects. Don't get me started on government schools, K through 12. That's another long discussion. And so the tremendous increase in borrowing and indebtedness in exchange for not very much is probably the saddest aspect of a very tragic situation.
Deroy, one of President Obama's biggest spending increases was Obamacare. Now Congress and the White House are bogged down over the future of Obamacare. If Congress doesn't act soon to repeal and replace Obamacare, what will that mean for the future of federal budgets?
Rowena, if the Republicans don't get their acts together and repeal and replace Obamacare with something sensible, you'll have a couple of very negative repercussions. One is continued deterioration in America's health care system, fewer choices as more and more people are in situations where they've got not five or four, three or two choices for health care, but only one. Something like about 48% of counties in the United States, if you're on Obamacare, you have your choice of one plan, unfortunately. And then in terms of the fiscal impact, the whole reason that Obamacare ever got elected was the Congressional Budget Office was able to keep the budget, the 10-year budget of spending for Obamacare under $1 trillion. So facing a price tag of about $900 billion over the next 10 years when this was passed in 2010, it got through barely, but based on the idea of a $900 billion expenditure. Well, fast forward from 2010 to the Congressional Budget Office's estimates for 2014 to 2023, and their 10-year budget window shows an expenditure of $2.6 trillion. Now, again, it was passed on the basis of a $900 billion price tag, and just 4 years later, the 10-year cost had ballooned 300%. Imagine if you go to, buy a suit for, $300, and all of a sudden you're wearing it and you find that it's not paid for, and by the way, it's now a $900 suit. I mean, that's more or less what the situation is with Obamacare. I can't imagine any retailer would stay in business for more than a few weeks if it operated that way. And unfortunately, with Obamacare, that's where we are. So worse healthcare, fewer choices, and a price tag that has tripled already since it originally was passed.
Well, if you turn on the TV lately, you see a lot of talking heads almost getting ready to have their heads explode over President Trump cutting deals with Chuck and Nancy. And one of the most high-profile deals that President Trump cut with Chuck and Nancy was over the temporary debt ceiling extension. What are your thoughts on that deal?
A lot of pundits on the right have attacked President Trump on that combined hurricane relief and debt limit increase, a deal that he did with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, and Trump has been pilloried on this on the right. My view on it's a bit different, which is that you shouldn't look at that deal just in a vacuum, but compared to whatever else was being offered. I'm very sad and frankly ashamed to say that Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan's deal they offered in that same meeting essentially was to keep borrowing and spending for 18 months and keep the fiscal situation careening along basically on autopilot. This is basically public spending brain death. Had they said, listen, we want to increase the debt limit for the next 18 months, but we want to put a cap on the total amount of federal spending or borrowing, that'd be one thing. Or if they said, okay, we're going to keep the debt limit going up, but we're going to audit every agency and use the learning from those audits to decrease spending, that would have been another proposal. Their whole idea was, hey, let's just keep doing what we're doing, keep on keeping on for a year and a half and push this whole thing, kick the can past the next midterm election. And Trump's heard that offer on the table, and they said, okay, how about 6 months? And Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer said, okay, let's do it for 3 months, and let's attach relief for the victims of Hurricane Harvey down in Texas and Louisiana. And oddly enough, to my astonishment, I think that was the more fiscally conservative offer, looking at those various things that have been presented to President Trump. So I think if Ryan and McConnell want to do deals and keep Trump interested and on board, they've got to do a lot better than just saying, hey, let's just keep doing what we're going to do for another year and a half. That was very unfortunate. What the Republicans should do for the next 3 months until the next vote comes up is talk about some of these ideas. So when the next time the debt limit is raised, there's something attached to it so that, yes, the debt limit goes up, but we've got some permanent cap on federal spending as a percentage of GDP. Again, audit every federal agency, something like the penny plan, which we can talk about in more detail, which also reduces spending basically 1% per year every year for the next 8 years and eventually balances out after that. If you couple that with debt limit increase, I think that makes a lot of sense. The one other thing I'd add to this is that if the debt limit were not increased with Nancy and Chuck, as you say, they would have turned that into political football, and they would have said, okay, we're not going to raise the debt limit until you agree to put DACA into law, or do something else that they want, or abandon Obamacare, or repeal and replacement, or something like that. So had this not been attached to hurricane relief and pushed through this week, I think they would have taken that very important measure and held it hostage until they could get Trump to do something else. So I think he really got off the hook lightly, and unlike a lot of my conservative free market brethren, I think that he got the better deal out of them than he did, sadly, out of what Ryan and McConnell were offering.
Deroy, what do you think of the plan that's been floated by Senator Schumer and seemingly embraced by President Trump to come up with some sort of permanent solution to these debt ceiling votes that seem to bring America's economy to the brink every 6 months or so?
I've not seen the actual proposal as to how this debt limit will be increased magically or something like that. So I'm not sure precisely what the formula might be that they're trying to put together. I think a sensible way to do it, again, would be to couple the debt limit increase when it needs to go up by X amount. It could be maybe something like what Milton Friedman might suggest, increase it by a certain fixed and predictable amount every year in exchange for something like the penny plan, which again is you cut the budget by 1%. This year we spend a dollar of federal spending. Next year it's 99 cents on the dollar. The year after that, 98 cents on the dollar. The year after that, 97 cents on the dollar, and so on. And after 8 years, you basically should be spending about, I think it's 93 cents on the dollar, and you will have federal spending at about 18% of GDP, and then you cap it. That becomes a ceiling of federal spending. If you could do that coupled with a sensible increase in the debt limit, I think essentially you'll have the economy growing, particularly if we get a very effective and dramatic and bold tax reduction and tax reform measure passed and signed by the president. And then I think this national debt will start to get into a field where we can grow our way out of it and get it under control. If something like that is a way of dealing with the national debt, that makes sense. If it's just, hey, let's just pull the cap off and borrow as much as we want and spend as much as we want, then that'd be a very disappointing and dangerous proposition.
PRI released the multi-part series by our economist Wayne Weingarten called Beyond the New Normal. And Wayne makes the point that, these days of 1% and 2% annual growth rates don't have to be the new normal for the U.S. economy, that with the right government policies in place, we can return to the days of 3, 4, 5% growth rates. One of the points he makes that kind of dovetails this debt conversation is that government spending, even though a lot of government spending is kind of couched in the value it will add to the economy, really doesn't actually boost the economy much at all, and that government rarely looks to see if their spending priorities, add value to the economy. So what are your thoughts on Wayne's thesis?
I think Wayne Weingard makes several very good points here. One is this idea that we're in a new normal, that we're stuck here at 2% growth. For whatever reason, we can't get beyond that. If we were doing this interview in 1979, you could have made the same point. We're stuck at 2% growth. Stagflation is here to stay. We can't do anything about it. There are limits to growth, as I think the so-called Club for Rome made a major economic declaration about that. And we could have resigned to ourselves to that and just crawl along on our bellies. Ronald Reagan didn't accept that. He said there's no reason we should be cursed to grow at 2% a year or less and then get stuck with both stagnation and inflation, which we had under Jimmy Carter. And despite what all the experts said, he ran on and won and then implemented dramatic tax reduction as well as regulatory relief and sound money. And guess what? Rather than growing at 2% a year, the economy boomed. I think it grew something like, 4-ish, 5-ish%, several points under Reagan. I think an average growth rate of something like 3.5%, pushing 4%. I graduated Georgetown University in 1986, and I think that year we grew something like over 5, pushing maybe 6%. And everybody I knew my age who wanted a job got a job. We weren't living in our moms and dads' basements for more than a few months until pretty much summer vacation ended, then we went to work. Some of us went to graduate school, what have you. And so I think there's no reason that in an economy with hardworking people we have in this country, the bright people we have in this country, the tremendous innovations in technology that didn't exist when I graduated college in 1986. We didn't have email back then. The internet was something that a few people in NASA used. There was no such thing as Google, no such thing as Facebook, no GPS, no cell phones, etc. So with all those amazing, miraculous inventions we have now and American ingenuity, things not invented yet, I think we can grow much more than this 2%. So I reject the new normal argument. We're trapped with that. Beyond that, I think Wayne Weingard makes another very important point, which is for all this money we're spending, are we getting any value? And I think very often you find that the government just starts handing out checks, giving money away like crazy, embarking on all kinds of projects. And it'd be one thing if we were getting some useful returns for all this federal spending, but in very, very many cases we don't. A couple examples. When the stimulus package was promoted by Obama right after he came in when we were suffering through the economic slowdown, we spent something like $819 billion in the stimulus program, and that was supposedly going to go to shovel-ready projects and new construction, infrastructure, and so on. And a very bright man by the name of Philip K. Howard, who wrote a terrific book called The Death of Common Sense, he took a look at the actual spending and determined that the actual amount of money that went into new highways, new bridges, new tunnels, et cetera, not 50%, not 40%, not 25%, only 3% of that massive stimulus program, about 3.7% actually went to what it was supposed to do, which is help build up our infrastructure. So there's a case of classic bait and switch. I call it basically fraud, telling people, listen, let us spend this money and you're going to have all kinds of wonderful new infrastructure. And actually 96% of that money went to other things. Only 4% of it went to that. Another good example of this is all the green money, all the green spending that's gone into green green technology, et cetera. Classic case being Solyndra. Something like $500 million, I believe, went into subsidies for this company that was going to make solar panels and so on and so forth. They went bankrupt. Their factories empty, padlocked, et cetera. The few jobs they did create were made at something like $500,000 per job created. I think if you go across the entire green money projects that Obama did, the cost per job was something like, I think, $175,000, $200,000. The private sector equivalent at the time, I think, was around 65, 70, something like this. So jobs are being created for something like 3 times the cost of creating a job in the private sector. So again, as Wayne Weingarten points out, if we were spending all this money getting something out of it, that'd be one thing. We spend all this money, get very little out of it, which is even more disappointing and frustrating, which is why it needs to stop.
Deroy, what concerns many of us is that due to the strengthening economy, that the Fed might continue to raise rates in the future. Of course, this is going to raise the interest costs on the national debt. Even worse, the growth in debt is unsustainable and dangerous to the U.S. economy in the long term. What's it going to take for Washington to finally pay attention to this?
This is a ticking time bomb, which I hope just keeps ticking, doesn't actually detonate, which is what happens if interest rates go up to their normal level, which is around 5% prime rate on average, something like that. Right now, I think it's running at 1.5, 2, something like this. And if interest rates just go back to their usual average, I believe the interest payments required to service the national debt are going to shoot up to something like $600 or $700 billion or something like that. It will be a huge increase, and this is going to squeeze out money not just for so-called tax cuts for the rich, which people on the right tend to like, but it means less money for food stamps, less money for Pell Grants, less money for taking care of senior citizens, less money for K through 12 education. So this is going to be a problem not just for priorities of people in the free market right. It's going to be a big problem for people on the big government spending left, because there will be a lot less money around for the stuff they like if we've got to spend all this money just to take care of the national debt and service it so we don't default. What will it take for Washington, D.C. to focus on this? I think perhaps if the interest rates start going up as the economy strengthens, maybe people will get a sense, we better take care of this. But as I tell my friends on the left, listen, at some point your oxes are going to start to get gored. So you need to be part of this discussion. You need to start offering solutions on this, or pretty soon it will be the things that people on the right like that will be in jeopardy. It'll be things that people on the left like will be in jeopardy.
So for our listeners who didn't get the chance to listen to your great talk today, we had a great joint event today with the Federalist Society. And one of the things that you talked about were 5 principles to guide smarter federal spending. Can you share those with our listeners and talk about, how that would make for better budgeting in Washington?
I think if we follow these 5 principles for lower and smarter spending, it would help get us into a situation of, if not total fiscal sanity, at least less fiscal insanity, which is what we have now. First of these is to understand that we're out of money. And if you don't believe me, you can look at a quote from former President Obama back in 2009, where he said, quote, "We're out of money," unquote. He understood it, unfortunately didn't seem to do very much about it. Number 2, we need to understand that money doesn't flow from geysers, especially not government money. I think some people believe that there's some kind of a giant treasure chest or a gold mine or something like this where politicians can go in and grab government money and go spend it on things. There have been public surveys where they've asked people, do you favor spending, I'm going to make up the number, $10 billion in taxpayer money on this new program? And people say, no, don't spend taxpayer money. And they'll say, all right, would you like to see $10 billion in government money spent? And people say, oh yeah, go ahead, spend the government money. And I think there are a lot of people out there who don't understand that government money is taxpayer money. It's all coming out of the same pockets, which is the pockets of you, me, and the people listening to my voice, and all of our friends, neighbors, and loved ones. And we need to understand that money comes from us. It doesn't come from anywhere else. The third idea, or third principle here is where necessary, if private charity is insufficient, government assistance should be targeted, not promiscuous. And I pointed the case of Chile, the country down down in South America. They were in a very bad economic situation in the late 70s. They had a military government. The military government brought in a number of people from the University of Chicago, a bunch of free marketeers, and they and other social scientists in Chile did what was called a map of extreme poverty. And they traveled around the country and tried to determine communities that were wealthy, communities that were working class, and others where people were so poor they had very little nutrition, disastrous health care, children dying of cholera, diarrhea, this unbelievably unspeakable conditions. And the government decided basically that the rich people would take care of themselves. The government would help working class people by deregulation, by reducing taxes, making the economy attractive so that businesses would expand and people would work their way into prosperity. And then to whatever degree you had government spending, it would be focused on the extreme poor who couldn't take care of themselves, who were too sick, suffering too much infant mortality to take care of themselves, and they focused on that and made sure that those people were okay. This should be the approach we take in this country. Instead, we have sort of I use the term shower the people, the wonderful song by James Taylor. It's a shower the people approach to government spending, where you shower the people with money. Just have for example, President G.W. Bush's Medicare drug plan. Rather than focusing on poor seniors without drug insurance, the idea was to give benefits to everybody over 65, including wealthy people with health insurance, and even with drug insurance. What people were getting was government sector drug benefits on top of their private sector drug benefits. That's just insanity. That's just crazy. So to the degree we have any government business or government assistance, it should be focused on people who really need it, not just giving out freebies for everybody. Fourth principle is, where necessary, if private charity is insufficient, government assistance should be limited to vouchers, not massive regulation-driven bureaucracies. For example, with Obamacare, if the program had been, like we're going to give some money to people who are too poor to take care of themselves and give each of them, let's say, a voucher for $5,000 to go out and get whatever insurance makes them happy, that would have been one thing, and Obamacare might be a lot more successful today. Instead, the thought was, let's turn life upside down for all 320 million Americans, not just the 18 million people who appear to have benefited from Obamacare in terms of getting coverage. And let's just not just give them vouchers, they go buy insurance they want, but let's have rules, regulations, red tape, commissions, advisory boards, consultants, and on and on and on. There is an amazing photograph. There's a podcast. Unfortunately, there's no video here, but I can show you the picture of Senator Mitch McConnell standing next to a giant pile of paper about 8 feet tall, representing the 13,000 pages of regulations that have been written by the Department of Health and Human Services to implement the Obamacare legislation, which itself is about 2,800 pages of dense, fine print. There's no reason to have that kind of a stultifying level of detail and confusion when we just simply could have said to the government, all right, listen, give people money to buy, let them buy what they want, and leave all the regulations and rules and so on to the private sector. Last but not least, first try economic growth. And the basic idea here is that whatever the challenges are facing the economy, things will be a lot easier to contend with if we have a thriving economy and economic growth that's healthy. For example, since 1960, the average recovery after a recession has been about 3.7%. It was only 2% or so under Obama, and through most of 2016 was only 1%. So for all the spending and regulations and activity that we saw under Obama, the economy only grew at 2%. If it grew at 3.7% or double that, I think the national debt we'd be growing our way out of it. We would have had much higher employment, a lot more people working, careers in much better shape. In fact, there's a very interesting statistic. If the economy had boomed under Obama at the same level that it did for the average recovery, you would have seen about another 6 or so million people at work. If we'd had the conditions under Obama that we did under Reagan, with lower taxes, less regulation, and so on, you would have seen something like an extra, I believe, 12 or so more million people at work, 12 more million jobs created during the Obama years. So these are very serious effects and a very serious lack of opportunity that all this expenditure and regulation and federal involvement created under Obama versus a much more market-oriented effort under Reagan. And it's really a crying shame that 12 million people who could be working today are not, because of the approach that Obama took.
Just as an aside, I actually took a photo of our President Sally Pipes in Senator McConnell's office right next to the Obamacare law and a stack of regulations. It was actually taller than her. It was quite funny. Deroy, you wrote a recent column where you urged Congress to take up the fight for not the minimum wage as a fight for $15 an hour, but the fight for a 15% corporate tax rate. But, advocates of lower corporate income tax usually do a terrible job of selling this. It's easily demonized as a tax cut for evil corporate America. So why don't you make the case, and how would working class Americans benefit from a lower corporate income tax?
Yeah, I think the beating heart of the tax cut and tax reform proposal that Congress is just starting to consider right now, I think, is the 15% corporate tax. And I really hope that President Trump pushes for this all the way to the bitter end, and Republicans stay unified and stick with this. Right now, our corporate tax rate is 35%. The good news I can say is we're number one. We have the highest corporate tax anywhere in the developed industrialized world, but it's not a distinction of which we should be proud. It is something that costs us a lot of money. It keeps businesses from moving into this country. It keeps companies in this country, keeps them moving out for greener pastures in China and Ireland and elsewhere. If we had a 15% corporate tax, it would be a more than 50% reduction. It would more than cut in half our corporate tax. It would put us well below the average corporate tax in the industrial world, which is about 22.5%. And with a 15% corporate tax, I think the idea of outsourcing would disappear. I think corporations in this country would stay here. It makes a lot more sense to run your country in the United States, even though our labor costs are higher than they are elsewhere around the world. If you're making that much more with that much lower a corporate tax, it doesn't make a lot of sense to pack up and move to China or move to Mexico. You'll just stay here and avoid all the expense and the transportation costs and having to learn Chinese and all that other stuff. And so I would recommend to Republicans on the Hill and free marketeers across the country to promote this not just as a massive corporate giveaway, but what I call a job creators tax cut and a job creators tax rate. And a 15% corporate rate, this is a low and attractive rate that will allow job creators in this country to create even more jobs for people who are looking for them, even more jobs for people in the middle class who want to see their careers advance, more money for promotions, more money for people who are entrepreneurs to get their new ideas and new products and new technologies approved and developed and available in the marketplace. And I think it's something that will be something like going up to putting a defibrillator on somebody who's on the ground who's not moving. And I think it will defibrillate this economy and get this economy moving along at 3.5%, 4%, 5% growth with all the good news that comes from that. The other thing I talk about this, which falls out of the realm of the economy as such, but I think there's a real social peace aspect to this. We've seen in recent weeks and months the kind of thing we normally aren't used to seeing in this country, which is basically race riots. People out in the streets beating each other over the heads, buildings on fire, mob rule. A lot of it driven by racial tension. And part of that, I think, is that when people are not paying their bills, having trouble making ends meet, not being able to take care of their loved ones, then, well, it's the Jews, and it's the blacks, and it's the Catholics, and it's the gays, and it's the Mexicans, and on and on and on. If people are paying their bills, taking care of themselves, going out to dinner every now and then, buying new cars, buying new homes and all that, then you aren't really worried about pointing fingers at people. In those sort of situations, you're a lot less likely to spend a lot of time pointing your fingers at people and trying to find people to blame for your problems. And so I think if we have a thriving economy with a 15% corporate tax at the heart of it and the kind of economic expansion we're talking about, I think a lot of the social and even racial tension that we've seen lately begins to diminish, and I think we begin once again to get along as equal and prosperous and happy American citizens. One of the biggest frustrations on the 15% corporate tax is watching Republicans negotiate with themselves. President Trump has been sticking with 15%. I've heard not too long ago Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, say, well, I think a better rate's 22.5. The man for whom I worked when I was in college as an intern, so Orrin Hatch, who's the head of the Senate Finance Committee, he said, well, it'd be miraculous if we can get below 25. If we keep that up, at some point, I think Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski said, well, I'm not going to vote for anything under 30, and so on. Now, it's one thing to sit in a room with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Dick Durbin and Kamala Harris, and they're saying, well, 15's too low, we got to get it up from there. But to see Republicans negotiating with themselves, pushing up the corporate tax rate every time they step up to the microphones is appalling. This is no way to negotiate. What Republicans should do is stick with 15%, talk about nothing but 15%, build public support for 15%, build up grassroots excitement for 15%. In the final analysis, if you're sitting in the conference committee working on final legislation that's going to be voted on by the House and Senate before they go home for Christmas, maybe Chuck Schumer says, look, if we don't get this, I'm not going to go with 15%, I'm walking out here. I'll take 17.5. Maybe we say, all right, Chuck, we'll shake on 17.5. We walk out the door and we get our 17.5%, which means you cut the corporate rate in half. Maybe that's how you do it. What you don't do is start negotiating with Republicans against each other before you've written the damn bill. This is a violation of negotiating 101. And maybe while the House is on vacation this coming week, if you can believe it, they all should go by negotiating 101 and read that book and learn how to negotiate, which is you stick with a tough position, you hold out to the last minute, and if you have to compromise, you compromise at the end. You don't start compromising before you put anything on the table.
Finally, a fun question. We call our podcast Another Round because PRI's offices are so close to wine country and we all love California wine. And it's especially appropriate to toast today because it's my friend and colleague Tim's birthday. So, Deroy, why don't you share with our listeners a favorite wine of yours that we can all try?
I'd be happy to. Well, first of all, let me say happy birthday to Tim. I've been sitting next to him this whole time. He didn't tell me his birthday, so happy birthday to you. I'm a big fan of California wines. I'm fortunate to spend a fair amount of time up in Sonoma County in particular. And a bad Sonoma wine is a pretty good wine anywhere else in the country. One of my favorites is a Pinot Noir from the Russian River Valley called Irony. It's delicious. It tastes wonderful. I think it's moderately priced at probably about $18 to $20 a bottle, something like that. And the label in very large letters says Irony, and it's an instant conversation piece. People grab a bottle, pour it, and say something like, "You call this a Pinot?" and make ironic comments. So it's both a wonderful, very drinkable and delicious wine, and very much like a good wine should, stimulates lively conversation.
Thanks, Deroy. Thanks, Tim. And happy birthday. Thanks to our guest, Deroy Murdock, and to my colleague, Tim Anaya. And by the way, this episode was taped in advance, so by the time you listen to this, Tim is a couple of weeks older. Mark your calendars for PRI's annual gala on November 1st, 2017. Our keynote speaker is Silicon Valley entrepreneur Peter Thiel. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And do us a favor and leave us positive feedback and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast at PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's a number 1. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back and listen to our next podcast.